Laughter echoed down the corridor of Hollow Ridge Station, ordinary and easy, the kind of sound that used to be rare in a place built for hard labor and long silences. It came from the mess hall, where Tavi was attempting, badly and enthusiastically, to teach two human children, newly arrived with their engineer parents, a clapping game learned from Rico, who was in turn trying to fix everyone's technique while laughing too hard to be very helpful about it. 6 months had passed since the standoff in the corridor, and the station Daniel Hutchins once ran as a forgotten mining outpost had become something else entirely, something none of the original crew, least of all Daniel, could have fully predicted. The fallout from that day had moved faster than anyone expected. Bryn's recorded testimony, combined with the enforcer footage of officers refusing direct orders, had spread across independent trading networks before corporate ever managed to contain it. What followed was not a clean, tidy resolution. Corporate never enjoyed those, but a messy, public relations disaster loud enough that quietly granting the 9 survivors formal asylum became easier for the company than continuing to fight a battle it was clearly losing in the court of public opinion. Hollow Ridge Station, once barely worth a passing mention on any official map, found itself unexpectedly famous. A small, stubborn outpost that had refused to hand over frightened refugees, and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, won. Daniel never much cared for the attention that came with it. He turned down more than one offer for interviews, more than one invitation to speak at some polished corporate event about diversity and compassion, dressed up in language he found faintly insulting given what it had actually cost to get here. He preferred, instead, to spend his days the same way he always had, fixing broken machinery, settling small disputes in the mess hall, and making sure everyone under his roof, human and otherwise, had enough to eat and somewhere warm to sleep. The station itself had grown. With the asylum grant came new funding, oddly enough, as several independent groups, moved by the story, sent supplies and volunteers eager to help build proper housing for the survivors and the families that had begun arriving alongside them. Walter, now officially in charge of engineering upgrades, had proudly overseen construction of an actual greenhouse, something Hollow Ridge Station had never had before, grown specifically because Nomi had mentioned once, almost in passing, how much her people missed the smell of green growing things. Nomi herself had become something close to indispensable, her early tinkering with translation software growing into a full communication system now used to welcome new arrivals, both human and alien, drawn to a station that had somehow become known as a place where people were not simply resources to be managed. Sula had changed the most, in ways that still occasionally surprised Daniel. The sharp suspicion that once colored nearly everything she said had softened into something steadier, though never fully gone, an edge of caution that Daniel suspected would always be part of who she was, earned honestly through everything she had survived. She had taken over coordinating supply logistics for the growing station population, a job Osei had happily handed to her once he realized she was better at spreadsheets than he had ever been. Osei himself had become one of the loudest advocates for the survivors among the original crew. The guilt from his early complaints during those tight ration weeks quietly turned into fierce, protective loyalty. Grace still ran the med bay, though it had expanded twice over since those first frightening days, now staffed with 2 additional medics, and stocked with proper supplies for the mixed population the station now called home. She still kept the same habit she always had, small gifts left quietly where they would be found, a tradition that Sula, without ever admitting it aloud, still quietly appreciated. Bren had taken on the role of something like a historian for the growing community, gathering not just the survivors' original story, but the station's story too. All of it, the good and the difficult, determined that whatever came next for this small, strange family built from disaster, it would be remembered honestly. Enrico, once too frightened to eat a piece of offered bread, had grown steadier with each passing month, though he still, without fail, stole a pair of Daniel's socks whenever the station ran cold, a habit Daniel had long since stopped pretending to mind. That evening, as the mess hall slowly filled for dinner, Daniel found himself at the head of a long table crowded with more people than it had ever held in his years running this station. Human faces and alien faces mixed together without a second thought, passing dishes back and forth, arguing cheerfully over whose turn it was to cook next. Tavi climbed into the seat beside him without asking, as had become habit, and held up a new drawing, more detailed than the first one scratched onto the recovery room wall so many months ago. It showed the whole station now, dozens of small figures standing together under painted stars, and near the middle of it, unmistakably, a round, tired-looking figure with a chipped mug in hand. Daniel looked at the drawing a long moment, throat tight in a way he did not bother trying to explain to anyone, and then he ruffled Tavi's head gently, the closest thing to thanks he knew how to give. "Looks about right," he said quietly. Outside the station's worn hull, the same cold stars kept their same distant watch they always had, indifferent to the small, stubborn miracle happening beneath them. But inside Hollow Ridge Station, in a mess hall full of noise and laughter and mismatched families built from loss and second chances, none of that distant cold mattered anymore. They had come frozen, hungry, and afraid. They had found, instead, a home. The drill bit screamed against rock, and no one on Hollow Ridge Station even looked up anymore. This was normal life at the edge of nowhere, a rusty tower on the side of an asteroid that no company photo ever wanted to show. Sparks and rock dust filled the mining bay, and the same 40 tired workers did the same jobs day after day, because someone had to dig the ore that made someone else rich, far away where the sky was blue and the food was fresh. Daniel Hutchins ran this place with a clipboard, a chipped mug, and a bad knee. He was the foreman, which meant every broken pipe, every fight, and every missed shipment landed on his desk. He was not young anymore, and he was not the kind of man who wanted his photo in a magazine. He liked things simple, rooms that were warm, mouths that were fed, and machines that did not blow up. That day started like any other, until the old comm officer, a wiry man everyone called Sparks because of his terrible haircut, ran into the mess hall waving a printout. "Foreman, you need to hear this," he said, breathless. "We caught a signal. It's weak, real weak, but it's a distress call." Daniel set down his mug. Distress calls were rare out here, and most of them were false alarms from broken satellites or pirates trying to lure a rescue ship into an ambush. Still, something about the way Sparks looked made him stand up. "Play it," Daniel said. The recording was mostly static, but under it there was a voice, thin and cracking, speaking words no translator on the station could fully understand. What came through clear enough, again and again, was a single repeated sound, almost like a plea. Then the signal died. "Where's it coming from?" Daniel asked. "A wreck," Sparks said. "Drifting about 6 hours out. Old ship, badly damaged. Sensors say it's been dead in space a long time. No power except one small backup cell, barely keeping something alive in there." Daniel looked around the mess hall. A dozen faces were watching him now, waiting. Corporate rules said clearly that Hollow Ridge Station was not a rescue outpost. Corporate rules said fuel and supplies were for approved runs only, and that unscheduled trips needed permission from an office 3-star systems away, an office that took weeks to answer even simple questions. Daniel had never cared much for corporate rules. "Get the tug ship ready," he said. "Walter, I want engines checked twice. Grace, prep the med bay for anything, and I mean anything. We don't know what's on that wreck." Walter Doyle, the station's old engineer, grumbled the whole way to the hangar, muttering about wasted fuel and paperwork that would land on all their heads. But he checked the engines twice anyway, because underneath the grumbling, Walter never once thought about leaving someone to die in the dark. Grace Whitfield, the station medic, packed emergency kits without being asked twice. She had learned long ago that when Daniel used that tone of voice, arguing only wasted time. The trip out was quiet and tense. Space had a way of making even brave people feel small, and the wreck, when it finally came into view, made the whole crew go silent. It was long and broken, its hull torn open in places like it can peeled apart by giant hands. No lights blinked. No engines hummed. It looked like a grave. "Bring us in slow," Daniel said. "Walter, cut away through that hull. Grace, you're with me." Inside, the ship was freezing, colder than open space should have allowed a working ship to get. Frost covered the walls. Broken pipes hung loose, leaking gas that had long since frozen into strange white patterns. The crew moved carefully, flashlights cutting through the dark, until they found a chamber deeper in the ship that still had a weak flicker of power. Grace was the first to see it. She stopped so suddenly that Walter nearly walked into her. "Daniel," she said quietly, "you need to see this." Rows of pods lined the chamber walls, most of them dark and silent, their occupants long gone. But a handful still glowed faintly, and behind fogged glass, shapes could be seen. Not human shapes. Thin limbs, large eyes closed in something between sleep and suffering, skin a shade no human skin had ever been. Alive, but only barely, held together by a system that was failing minute by minute. Daniel put his hand against the cold glass of the nearest pod. Inside, a small shape shivered even in stillness, curled tight, its face pinched with something that looked painfully like fear. He thought of the corporate rules. He thought of the fuel budget, the paperwork, the weeks it would take some distant office to approve helping strangers who were not even human. Then he thought about what kind of man leaves a frightened, freezing child, of any species, to die alone in the dark. "Walter," Daniel said, his voice steady, "get these pods stable and moved. All of them. We're taking every single one back to the station." Walter did not argue this time. He simply nodded and got to work. As the last pod was loaded onto the tug ship, Daniel looked back at the broken wreck one more time, wondering how many other ships like this one were drifting out there, forgotten, and how many people like these had never been found in time. Hollow Ridge Station was about to change forever, and Daniel Hutchins, a tired foreman with a bad knee and a chipped mug, had no idea just how much. Cold was the only thing Rico had known for what felt like forever, a cold so deep it did not feel like weather anymore. It felt like a place. Then, slowly, the cold began to crack, and something warm pressed in at the edges of it. And with the warmth came pain, sharp and sudden, like waking up a limb that had fallen asleep, except it was an entire body waking up at once. Rico's eyes opened to blinding light and a face that did not belong to any of the old crew, a face with strange pale skin, small ears, and eyes that were watching with something Rico did not expect to see from a stranger: worry. Grace leaned back the moment Rico's eyes opened, giving space instead of crowding in, because she had learned long ago that frightened patients needed room to breathe before they needed anything else. "You're safe," she said gently, even though she knew the words meant nothing yet, since no translator program had caught up to whatever language this small, shivering creature spoke. Rico tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, muscles screaming from disuse, and a monitor nearby beeped in alarm. Grace moved quickly but calmly, easing Rico back down, speaking in a low, steady voice the whole time, the tone matching more than the words. Outside the med bay, Daniel paced the hallway with a tablet full of readings he barely understood. 11 pods, and 11 fragile lives inside them. 2 had not survived the trip back, their systems failing before Grace could stabilize them, and Daniel had stood beside those empty pods a long moment before ordering them removed with more care than most people would give a fallen soldier. 9 were left, 9 strangers from nowhere, now breathing station air for the first time. Sula was the second to wake, and unlike Rico, she came up fighting. She tore the monitoring wires from her arm the moment she had the strength, backing into a corner of the room, eyes wide and wild, clearly ready to defend herself against whatever came near. Grace backed off immediately, hands raised, empty, showing there was nothing to fear. "She's protecting someone," Daniel said quietly from the doorway, watching Sula's eyes dart constantly toward the pod beside her, where Rico still lay weak but awake. "That's her family in there." It took 2 full days before Sula allowed anyone close enough to check on Rico properly, and even then, she never left the smaller one's side, sleeping propped against the wall, refusing every offer of a proper bed. Daniel understood something about that kind of stubbornness. He had it himself. Food became the next battle. The station's kitchen had nothing built for alien stomachs, and Grace worried constantly about poisoning someone by accident with something as simple as bread or broth. Daniel solved it the same simple way he solved most problems, slowly and by example. He sat on the floor of the recovery room, well below the height where he might seem threatening, and he broke a piece of plain bread in half, eating one half himself first, chewing slowly, showing there was nothing hidden in it. Then he held the other half out, not forcing it forward, just holding it there, patient as stone. Rico stared at the offered bread for a long moment, then at Daniel's face, then back at the bread. Hunger finally won over fear, and small fingers, still weak and shaking, reached out and took it. That single moment, bread passed from a tired human foreman's hand to a frightened alien child's, was the real beginning of everything that followed. Word of the rescue had, of course, reached the wider station by then, and not everyone was happy about it. Supplies were already thin at Hollow Ridge, and now there were 9 more mouths to feed, mouths that ate strange foods or refused normal ones, and needed care nobody on staff had trained for. Some workers grumbled in the halls. A few outright complained to Daniel's face, asking why station resources, already stretched thin, should go to strangers who were not even the same species. Daniel's answer was always the same, delivered without heat, but without room for argument either. They were dying. Now they're not. That's the whole reason. I don't need a better one. Slowly, though, something began shifting. Walter, who had grumbled the loudest about the rescue mission itself, found himself sitting one evening beside the pod chamber turned recovery room, showing one of the smaller aliens, a curious one who would later be known as Tavi, how a simple hand tool worked. Tavi's eyes went wide with delight at the small mechanism, and Walter, against his own gruff nature, found himself smiling. Bryn, the oldest of the survivors, was the last to wake, and the calmest. Where Sula had come up fighting and Rico had come up trembling, Bryn woke slowly, looked around the unfamiliar room with sharp, careful eyes, and said nothing at all for a long while, simply watching everything and everyone with the quiet patience of someone who had survived far worse than this. By the end of the first week, all 9 survivors were stable. Weak, still frightened in quiet moments, but alive, and for the first time in longer than any of them could say warm. Daniel stood at the observation window one night, looking out at the cold stars beyond the station, and thought about how strange it was that a broken old mining outpost, forgotten by the very company that owned it, had somehow become the safest place in the galaxy for 9 strangers with nowhere left to go. He did not know yet how much that would cost him. He only knew, standing there in the quiet hum of the station, that he would not trade a single moment of it. A drawing appeared on the wall of the recovery room one morning, done in charcoal salvage from a broken filter unit, and nobody knew who had made it until Grace found Tavi sitting cross-legged beneath it, proudly pointing up at the shapes scratched into the metal. It showed a group of stick figures, some tall and thin, some short and round, standing together under a sun that did not look like any star the humans recognized. Tavi pointed at one of the round figures, and then at Daniel, who happened to be walking by at that exact moment. "That's you," Grace said, laughing, translating Tavi's excited pointing as best she could. "I think that means he trusts you now." 3 weeks had passed since the rescue, and Hollow Ridge Station had settled into a strange new rhythm. The 9 survivors were stronger now, no longer confined to the med bay, moved instead into an unused cargo section that Walter and a handful of volunteers had converted into a proper living space, complete with salvage furniture and lighting adjusted to be gentler on eyes that seemed sensitive to the station's usual harsh glow. Language was coming along slowly, piece by piece, through gestures, drawings, and a translation program that Nomi, one of the survivors who had turned out to have a surprising gift for machinery, had actually helped improve herself, tinkering with the station's old software late into the night with Walter at her side. It was through these broken, growing conversations that the crew finally began to understand what had happened to Rico, Sula, Bryn, Tavi, Nomi, and the 4 others who made up their small group. Their homeworld, they explained through Bryn, who had once served as something like a teacher or record keeper before everything fell apart, had been swallowed by a war they never started, fought over resources their own leaders had sold away to a stronger power for promises that never came true. When their world's systems finally collapsed, ships were sent out carrying whoever could be loaded aboard in time. Most of those ships, Bryn explained with a steadiness that made the weight of the words even heavier, never made it anywhere at all. Sula still would not fully relax around most of the crew, though she had softened slightly, especially toward Grace, who had a habit of leaving small gifts of dried fruit near her without ever making a show of it. But it was Daniel that Sula watched the closest, and one evening, she finally cornered him in the narrow hallway outside the mess hall. "Why?" she asked, her words still clumsy through the translator, but clear enough in meaning, "You help us. We nothing to you." Daniel considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things, without rushing an answer just to fill silence. "Where I come from," he said finally. "Helping someone who's drowning isn't something you think about first. You just do it. Figuring out why comes later, if it ever needs figuring out at all." Sula did not look fully satisfied with that answer, but something in her posture eased slightly, just enough that Daniel noticed. Not everyone on the station shared Daniel's easy patience. However, a supply officer named Osei, normally mild-mannered, had grown increasingly tense as station rations stretched thinner with each passing week. He was not cruel, but he was worried, and worried people sometimes said sharp things. "We're a mining station, not a shelter," Osei said bluntly during one crew meeting, arms crossed. "Corporate is already asking questions about our numbers not matching up. Sooner or later, someone up the chain is going to notice 9 extra people eating our food and breathing our air. Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Daniel said simply. "And if corporate decides they don't like the answer?" Osei pressed. Daniel did not have a clean answer for that, and he did not pretend to. But that same week, almost as if summoned by Osei's worry, a message arrived from the regional corporate office, flagged urgent, addressed directly to Daniel. He read it alone in his small office, the old chair creaking under him as he leaned back, jaw tightening with every line. The message was polite in the cold, careful way corporate messages always were, full of words like compliance and asset management, but underneath the polite language, the meaning was clear enough. Unregistered non-human individuals discovered aboard station operations were to be reported immediately and held for transfer to an approved relocation authority. Daniel had heard stories about that kind of relocation before, whispered stories from other stations, stories that never had happy endings attached to them. He sat there a long while after reading it, the hum of the station around him, and thought about Rico taking that first piece of bread from his hand, about Tavi's proud little drawing on the recovery room wall, about Bryn's steady, sorrowful voice describing a world that no longer existed. Then Daniel Hutchins did something he had never done in all his years working for the company. He deleted the message without replying, and he began quietly making sure that whatever came next, Hollow Ridge Station would be ready for it. Outside his office window, Tavi's laughter echoed faintly down the hall, chasing after Walter with a tool in hand, utterly unaware that somewhere far away, a decision had just been made about all their lives. Silence fell over the mess hall in a way it rarely did at Hollow Ridge Station, the kind of silence that comes right after someone says something nobody wanted to hear out loud. Daniel stood at the head of the long metal table, both hands pressed flat against it, and told his crew, plainly and without softening it, that a second message had arrived from corporate. This one was not polite anymore. This one had a date attached to it, and a ship. 5 days, Daniel said. A transport is coming, with an escort. They're calling it a compliance retrieval. What that means is they're coming to take Rico, Sula, Bryn, Tavi, Nomi, and the others, and hand them over to something called a relocation authority. Walter's jaw tightened. Grace set down the cup she had been holding, very carefully, as if setting it down loudly might break something more than glass. Even Osei, who had pushed hardest about the ration numbers, went quiet, his earlier worry curdling into something closer to guilt. "What happens at this relocation authority?" someone near the back asked. Daniel did not answer right away, because the honest answer was that he did not fully know, only that Bryn, when shown the words on a translated printout, had gone very still and very pale, and had said only one word, over and over, a word the translator rendered simply as processed. That word was enough for everyone in the room. "So what do we do?" Grace asked finally. "We don't hand them over," Daniel said. There was no dramatic flourish in his voice, no speech about heroics. It was simply a statement of fact, the same tone he used when announcing a broken generator needed fixing. "I don't have a full plan yet. But that part isn't up for debate." Not everyone agreed easily. A tense argument broke out, voices rising over each other, some crew members pointing out that refusing corporate orders could mean losing their jobs, their contracts, maybe worse, out here at the edge of nowhere where the company's word was close to law. Daniel let them argue it out, because he believed people deserved the chance to be angry and afraid out loud before deciding what kind of people they wanted to be. In the end, nobody at that table chose to walk away. Word of the coming transport reached the survivors quickly, through Nomi's improved translator and through the simple, unmistakable tension that had settled over the station like a change in air pressure. Fear, an old and familiar feeling for all 9 of them, crept back into the recovery quarters. That evening, Sula found Daniel alone in the observation deck, staring out at the stars the way he often did when his mind was too full for sleep. "You should give us to them," Sula said, without any greeting first, her voice sharper than usual. "Save your station. Save your people. We are not worth this to you." Daniel turned to face her fully. "That's not your call to make," he said, "and it's not up for negotiation." "Why?" Sula demanded again. The same question she had asked weeks earlier in the hallway, but with real desperation behind it this time. Why risk everything, your job, your home, for strangers not your kind? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words the way a man chooses footing on unstable ground. "You keep asking me that like there's some clever answer hiding underneath it," he said finally. "There isn't one. You're not strangers anymore. Rico sleeps 2 doors down from my quarters and steals my socks because they're warmer than his blankets. Tavi drew my ugly face on the recovery room wall. Bren tells stories at dinner that make grown men on this crew go quiet. That's not strangers, Sula. That's family. And I don't hand family over to anyone." Sula stared at him, something complicated moving behind her eyes. Years of learned distrust fighting against the plain, stubborn honesty in front of her. "On my world," she said finally, quietly, "family did not always mean safety." "Then maybe it's about time that changed for you," Daniel said. For the first time since her arrival, Sula did not have a sharp reply ready. She simply stood beside him at the window, watching the same distant stars, until the silence between them stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling like something closer to peace. The days that followed moved fast. Walter and Nomi worked side by side almost around the clock, rerouting old mining defenses, magnetic clamps and heavy loaders never meant for combat repurposed into blunt tools of resistance. Grace prepared the med bay for the worst outcomes she refused to say out loud. Bryn gathered the other survivors together and began recording their testimony properly this time. Every detail of what had happened to their world, determined that if nothing else survived this, the truth would. Osei, to everyone's quiet surprise, was the one who suggested quietly leaking word of the coming retrieval to a sympathetic contact at a nearby independent trading post, someone who might spread the story further than corporate wanted it to travel. Daniel watched his station transform around him, a tired mining outpost turning itself, piece by piece, into something that looked almost like a fortress, and he felt no fear about the decision he had made, only a steady, grim certainty that whatever happened when that transport arrived, Hollow Ridge Station would not go quietly. 5 days passed faster than anyone wanted them to. On the 6th morning, the alarms finally sounded, announcing an incoming ship on final approach, and every single person on the station, human and otherwise, moved to their places without needing to be told twice. The transport ship was larger than anything Hollow Ridge Station had ever docked, its hull painted the clean, cold white of a company that had never once set foot on the stations it owned. 2 smaller escort vessels flanked it, sleek and armed, and their presence alone told everyone watching from the station's cracked observation windows exactly how seriously corporate was taking this. Daniel stood at the main airlock with Grace and Walter beside him, and behind them, spread carefully through the corridor in a formation Walter had planned with more skill than anyone expected from a grumbling old engineer, the rest of the station crew waited. Further back, out of the Enforcer's first line of sight, Nomi crouched near a control panel she had rewired days earlier, ready to move the instant she was needed. The airlock hissed open, and a man in a crisp gray uniform stepped through first, flanked by 4 armed enforcers whose faces were hidden behind smooth, featureless visors. The man introduced himself as a compliance officer, his voice as flat and practiced as a recorded announcement, and he held out a data pad displaying the retrieval order. "Foreman Hutchins," he said, "you are required to surrender the 9 unregistered individuals currently residing on this station. Failure to comply is a breach of contract, punishable by immediate termination of your operating license and possible criminal charges." "They're not cargo," Daniel said evenly. "You don't get to retrieve people." The compliance officer's expression did not change. "This conversation was anticipated," he said, and gestured, and the 4 enforcers stepped forward. What happened next happened fast. Walters rerouted magnetic clamps, built originally to hold heavy loads of ore in place during transport, slammed shut across the corridor floor, plating with a force that sent two enforcers sprawling, their boots suddenly locked fast to the metal beneath them. Nomi, watching from her hidden panel, cut power to a section of overhead lighting, plunging that stretch of corridor into flickering half-darkness that favored the defenders who knew every inch of the station by memory. The enforcers were trained, but they were trained for compliance stations, not one that had spent 5 days quietly turning itself into a trap built with old mining tools and a stubborn engineer's imagination. Confusion spread through their ranks fast. In the middle of the chaos, Bryn stepped forward, unarmed, hands raised, walking directly toward the compliance officer with a calm that seemed almost unnatural given the noise around them. "Wait," Bryn said, voice steady even through the translator's clumsy delivery. "Before more of this, you should see something." Bryn held out a small data drive, the one containing days of careful testimony, recordings of the survivors describing exactly what had happened to their homeworld, and more importantly, exactly what a relocation authority had done to others taken before them. Details pulled from fragmented ship logs recovered from the original wreck. Details that painted a much darker picture than any polite corporate memo ever would. The compliance officer hesitated, and that hesitation was its own kind of victory. "Play it," Daniel said, stepping up beside Bryn. "Right here, right now, on an open channel. Let your whole crew hear it. Let it get logged. Let's see how many of your people still want to finish this job once they know exactly what they're delivering these people into." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then, unexpectedly, one of the enforcers, the one still struggling against Walter's magnetic clamp, reached up and removed her visor entirely, revealing a young woman not much older than Nomi looked in alien years. "Play it," she said quietly, echoing Daniel's words, staring hard at her own commanding officer. "I want to hear it too." The recording played over the open comm channel, Bryn's steady voice describing horrors in careful, unflinching detail, and slowly, visibly, something shifted in the enforcers still standing. Weapons that had been raised lowered, just slightly, uncertainty replacing blind obedience. Daniel used that shift without hesitation. "Your orders came from an office that's never once set foot out here," he said, addressing all of them now, not just the officer. "I'm asking you to make your own choice, right now, standing in this hallway. Are you here to protect people, or are you here to hand children over to something you just heard with your own ears?" The compliance officer opened his mouth to give an order, but no order came out, drowned by the sound of his own enforcers, one by one, powering down their weapons. It was not a clean victory. Voices grew heated all over again as the officer tried, and failed, to regain control of the situation, threatening consequences that suddenly felt very far away and very unlikely to matter. In the confusion, Daniel took a glancing hit from a stun baton meant for someone else entirely, dropping him hard against the corridor wall, pain flaring bright through his shoulder. Rico, who had been watching from a side corridor against every instruction to stay hidden, broke free of Sula's grip and ran straight to Daniel's side, small hands pressed against his arm, face twisted with a fear that had nothing to do with the enforcers anymore. "Stay," Rico said, one of the few words learned clearly enough to need no translation at all. "Stay, stay." Daniel, through the pain, managed something close to a laugh. "Not going anywhere, kid," he said. "Promise." By the time the standoff finally ended, the compliance officer retreating with his remaining enforcers back toward the transport, defeated not by force alone, but by his own people's refusal to keep following him. Word of what had happened at Hollow Ridge Station was already spreading, carried by more than one enforcer's private, furious message sent to contacts far beyond corporate's reach. Hollow Ridge Station had not just survived the day. It had, quietly and without meaning to, started something much bigger than one tired foreman and 9 frightened survivors.